Hi, my name is Emily Reed. I'm 24 years old, and I've just completed the final chapter of my 4 years studying business administration at the University of Washington. From the outside, my life might seem steady. I studied hard, never caused trouble, and always kept a neat, respectable image. But inside, I had grown used to walking a thin line between wanting to be loved and the cold reality that in my family, I had never been the one who mattered most. Since I was little, I learned to observe, to notice every change in my father's tone, every furrow of my mother's brow, so I would know when to stay silent and when to say something just safe enough. I was patient, sometimes to the point of seeming resigned, because I understood that any reaction would be measured against Sophia, my sister, 2 years younger, the shining jewel always kept at the center. My father, Michael Reed, a 56-year-old man with a certain reputation in Seattle's construction industry, owned a mid-sized company. Not massive, but big enough for his name to appear at business association dinners, and for him to be invited to speak about the secrets of success. But at home, he was not the picture of a warm, approachable father. Short-tempered and obsessed with appearances, he treated everything in our household as an extension of his personal reputation. If Sophia won an award, it was the Reed family's success. If I achieved something, he would give a small smile, say, "That's good," and quickly change the subject to my sister's accomplishments. My mother, Patricia, 54, didn't work full-time, but her schedule was always filled with tea parties, charity events, and fashion shows. She had a polished way of speaking, always smiling in public, but she never hesitated to give me sharp remarks when no one else was around. To her, everything was an opportunity to elevate social standing, and that meant Sophia, with her beauty and impeccable style, was the most prized asset. I was not the kind of daughter she liked to show off to her friends. Sophia, 22, embodied everything my parents admired. Studying fashion in Los Angeles, she was, in my mother's words, stylish, promising, with a bright future. Whenever Sophia came home, the whole family seemed to orbit around her. My father took her to expensive restaurants. My mother took her shopping in boutiques I had never set foot in. And me? I was usually on the sidelines, forcing a smile while they discussed plans for Sophia's future, knowing no one would ask about mine. The difference in treatment wasn't just in words, it was clear in every financial decision and investment. When Sophia wanted to study in Los Angeles, my parents immediately covered her full tuition, rented her a small apartment in Beverly Hills, and sent extra money each month so she could focus on studying without financial worries. When I chose the University of Washington, just a few hours' drive from home, they told me I should be independent and only offered minimal help, with the rest covered by my grandparents, James and Elizabeth Reed. It was my grandparents who freed me from the financial pressure of student loans. They not only covered the remainder of my tuition, but also sent money for books, living expenses, and sometimes small gifts during the holidays. But the greatest help wasn't financial. It was in their unconditional trust and support. James and Elizabeth lived in a 2-story wooden house on the outskirts of Seattle with a backyard full of lavender and dozens of apple trees. It was the place I ran to whenever I felt I didn't belong in my parents' home. They never compared me to Sophia, never asked why I didn't do this or that. Like my sister, they listened, remembering every small detail I told them, from my favorite subjects to my little worries about the future. To me, they were not just a source of comfort, but proof that unconditional family love could exist, something I had never received from my parents. I still remember those summer mornings at their house when my grandfather would wake me early to go into the garden to pick fruit, working as he told me stories about the early days of starting his business with just 3 workers. My grandmother taught me to cook dishes I had never seen on my parents' dining table, smiling as she reminded me, cooking isn't just about recipes. It's about love. Those days made me feel part of something warm and lasting, but returning from their home, everything fell back into the usual pattern. I became the ordinary daughter in my parents' eyes, never remarkable enough to be noticed, but always expected to step in if Sophia needed something. Over the years, I had learned not to expect much from them, placing my trust instead in myself and in my grandparents. I didn't know that just a few months after graduation, everything would change completely, and the only fragile bond left between me and my family would be torn apart in a single afternoon. My graduation day came on an early June morning when the air in Tacoma was just warm enough for sunlight to stream through the trees, yet still carried a trace of coolness. I woke earlier than usual, carefully preparing the gown and cap I had dreamed of wearing since high school. It should have been a family reunion, a day when everyone came together, took photos, hugged, and celebrated the years of hard work. But even in the planning stage, I knew that wouldn't happen. A week earlier, my mother had called, her voice laced with a hint of false regret, telling me that she and my father were very sad but couldn't attend my graduation because they had already booked tickets to Los Angeles for Sophia's Fashion Week. She added that it was an opportunity she couldn't miss because she'd get to meet top designers. And me? I just nodded over the phone, keeping my voice calm. I understand. Deep down, I knew exactly where I stood on my parents' list of priorities. That morning, the University of Washington campus was a sea of green gowns filled with laughter and cheers from families gathered for photos. I walked through the crowd, forcing a smile even though I knew my family's seats would remain empty. My classmate Jessica had her parents, siblings, and even her grandparents fly in from Texas to cheer her on. I had only a few close friends there to congratulate me. When my name was called and I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I felt a gaze on me from afar. At first, I thought it was my imagination until I saw a man standing near the exit, dressed in a light gray suit, holding an envelope. He gave a slight nod when our eyes met. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to thin out, the man walked toward me. "Emily Reed?" he asked, his voice deep, clear, yet gentle. I nodded. "I'm David Thompson, attorney for James and Elizabeth Reed. We need to talk." The moment I heard my grandparents' names, a lump rose in my throat. It had been a month since they passed away in an accident on their way home from the farm in Snohomish County. A truck had lost control and hit them head-on while they were driving along a narrow mountain pass. The police said it happened so quickly they didn't have time to feel pain. But for me, the grief was still raw, as if just yesterday I had heard my grandmother's voice on the phone reminding me not to forget my coat when going out. David handed me a business card, then said, "Your grandparents left specific instructions in their will, and it's time we carry them out." He invited me and my family to his downtown Seattle office over the weekend for the reading of the will. At that, I felt a flicker of confusion. I had never thought about inheritance or property. In my mind, my grandparents' estate would naturally be divided among my father, my aunt, and perhaps a portion to the grandchildren, meaning Sophia and me. The idea that they might have left something solely to me had never crossed my mind, but there was something in David's manner that made me feel this was more serious than usual. He didn't give any more details, only told me to be there on time. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at photographs of my grandparents. One was taken just last spring in their backyard, when the lavender had just begun to bloom. My grandmother was smiling brightly, and my grandfather had his arm around my shoulders as if to say, "You are our pride and joy." The memory was both comforting and bittersweet. I recalled the times they had gently reminded me, "If anything ever happens, remember David Thompson?" But I had never asked for specifics. I thought it was just their way of making sure paperwork was in order as they got older. Now, each of those words felt like a piece of a puzzle whose picture I couldn't yet see. 2 days after graduation, I made my way back to Seattle to prepare for the meeting at the law office. Walking into the city without my grandparents there felt strange, familiar yet missing something I couldn't name. I passed streets my grandfather used to drive me down when I was little, bakeries my grandmother loved to visit every Saturday morning. Everything was still there. And yet everything had changed. I didn't know where the reading of the will would lead, only that this would be the first time since the funeral that my family and I would sit together in the same room. The night before the meeting, My mother called to remind me not to dress too plainly because it's still a lawyer's office. You need to make a good impression. I pressed my lips together, wondering who exactly she hoped to impress when this was a family matter. My father sent a short text. Tomorrow, get straight to the point. No beating around the bush. I wasn't sure what the point meant to him, but I guessed he was already thinking about the assets, even though no one had mentioned them directly since David's invitation. Sophia didn't say a word to me, but I saw on her Instagram that she'd posted a photo in a Beverly Hills cafe with the caption, "Flying back to Seattle for this boring family thing." Reading that, I knew this meeting wouldn't be the dry formality my father imagined. It was going to be a confrontation I couldn't yet picture. When I went to bed that night, a part of me still believed my grandparents would divide their estate fairly among everyone. They had always taught me about kindness, fairness, and mutual respect. I told myself that even though my father's relationship with them had been strained, they wouldn't cut off their own son. And I, as their granddaughter, would likely receive only a symbolic portion. But I underestimated their thoroughness and their resolve. I didn't know that the next morning, when I stepped into the warm, wood-paneled office of David Thompson, I would hear words that would leave my entire family stunned and send my life down a completely different path. That morning, Seattle's sky was heavy and gray, like it was wrapped in a thin veil of fog, with a light drizzle falling over the cobblestone street outside the old building that housed David Thompson's office. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a simple black dress and a beige trench coat, partly to honor my grandparents, partly to conceal the tremor in my body. Inside, the scent of aged oak and faint peppermint tea gave me a brief, unexpected comfort, but it didn't last. David met me in the hallway, shook my hand lightly, and said quietly, "Thank you for coming early, Emily. We'll start as soon as everyone arrives." Moments later, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed. My father, Michael Reed, walked in first, his face set in a rigid expression, his expensive black suit unable to hide his impatience. Close behind was my mother, Patricia, in a leather coat and a bright silk scarf, clutching her handbag, as if it held her whole world. Sophia entered last, blonde curls, bold red lipstick, and a chic jumpsuit that couldn't have been more out of place for her grandparents' will reading. All three looked at me, their eyes a mixture of detachment and calculation, as if trying to gauge how much I knew. We sat around a large walnut table in the conference room. David took the seat at the head, a thick folder laid out in front of him, his laptop already open. He began in a calm, measured tone. "Before I read the will, I want to confirm that James and Elizabeth Reed were fully lucid and sound of mind when they executed this will last year. They were evaluated by 2 independent physicians, and I was a direct witness." My father let out a short, derisive laugh. "No need for the preamble, David. We all know they'll split the assets among their children. Nothing surprising here." David glanced at my father, then began reading. He listed each item: $14 million in cash and stocks, a diversified investment portfolio valued at $12 million, real estate holdings, including the main house, the Snohomish County farm, and 3 rental properties totaling $9 million, and 1 million shares in Reed Construction. He paused, his eyes moving across each of our faces, then read the next line with a clarity that made every word hang in the air. "We, James Reed and Elizabeth Reed, hereby leave all of the above assets to our granddaughter, Emily Reed, as the sole heir." The room sank into a dense silence. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears and the patter of rain against the window. My mother raised her eyebrows as if she'd misheard. Sophia's mouth fell open, mascara already starting to smudge at the corners of her eyes. My father was the first to react. "What? Only to Emily? Is this some kind of joke?" He slammed his hand on the table, sending the pen in front of David rolling to the floor. David remained composed. "Let me repeat. The entire $36 million, both tangible and intangible assets, go to Emily Reed. There is no provision for any other division." Patricia leaned back in her chair with a thin smile. That's ridiculous. A girl who only knows theory with no real experience managing money. What is she going to do with all that? Clearly, they were emotionally influenced. Her voice stressed the last two words, a thinly veiled suggestion that I had somehow courted my grandparents' favor to benefit from their estate. By now, Sophia had begun to cry, her tears mixing with the streaks of expensive makeup. You're so selfish, Emily. You know what this family needs. You're tearing everything apart just because you're clinging to your name on that stupid piece of paper. David raised a hand for silence and continued. Your grandparents left a video. They wanted to explain this decision themselves. He pressed a button on his laptop, and the large screen in the corner of the room flickered to life. My grandparents appeared, sitting together in their old armchairs in the living room, bathed in warm light. My grandfather wore a deep blue sweater. My grandmother had draped around her shoulders the silk scarf I'd given her for her birthday. My grandfather began, If you're watching this, it means we are no longer in this world. We want to be clear about our reasons. My grandmother looked directly into the camera. Michael, Patricia, and Sophia, we love you. But we cannot ignore the truth that for many years you have treated family as a source of gain, not as a place to share and belong. Emily is the only one who has upheld the values we hold dear. My grandfather continued, We have seen Emily visit every week, helping with small things without ever asking for anything in return. She chose a career that may not bring much money, but it brings meaning. The rest of you have kept your distance, only showing up when you needed something. My grandmother nodded, her eyes glistening. This inheritance is not a reward, it is a responsibility. Emily, we trust you will use it to do good, not to show off or chase trends. The video ended with the two of them holding hands, smiling. The room was silent for several seconds before my father burst out. Ridiculous. They were old, their memory was failing, and they were clearly manipulated by Emily. I'll sue to overturn this will. My mother chimed in. This family needs someone with experience like Michael to manage things, not a girl who just graduated from college. Sophia wiped her tears, but her voice was still sharp. Don't you feel ashamed taking everything? Everyone will see you as a traitor. I looked at each of them, realizing that not one had asked how I felt about losing my grandparents. They only saw the money inside me. A mix of pain and clarity began to rise. David closed the folder with a firm tone. This will is protected by every safeguard the law allows. Changing it would be nearly impossible. My father clenched his jaw. We'll see. Then he turned to me, his gaze like a blade. But remember, Emily, we're still family, and family always finds a way to resolve things. I knew that resolve in his mouth carried no hint of reconciliation. Right after the reading, as David walked me out of the conference room, my father stepped into the hallway to block my way, arms crossed over his chest. He stood like a wall, his voice lowered but edged with threat. We're not going to waste time on legal games. Set a time for you, your mother, and me to sit down and sign everything over to me. You won't have to worry about a thing. I'll give you enough to live comfortably without ever thinking about money again. I drew in a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, and met his eyes. No, I know what my grandparents wanted, and I will not go against their wishes. This isn't a matter for negotiation. In an instant, the false friendliness vanished, replaced by his usual coldness. Before I could turn away, my mother stepped up beside him, the sharp scent of her perfume mingling with the leather from the hallway chairs, making my stomach twist. She tilted her head, her voice soft as a whisper but heavy with warning. Emily, don't be foolish. This is a family matter, and you're making it messy. If you hand over the assets, we'll leave you alone. Might even help you buy a new apartment, but if you don't, she glanced at my father, then don't blame us for cutting you off completely. That night, I received a string of messages from my father. At first, his tone carried a trace of restraint. Think carefully. Don't make yourself look selfish in the eyes of the whole family. But only a few lines later, the threats became obvious. If you don't agree, I will sue. I know the law, and I'll drag this out until you're exhausted. In another message, he brought up a detail I had almost forgotten. The lease for my current apartment in Tacoma had been guaranteed under my parents' names. Don't forget who helped you have a place to live. Don't make me use my rights, he wrote. I knew exactly what he meant. If I didn't comply, he would have no hesitation in using that to throw me out. To pile on the pressure, my mother called later that night. Her voice had lost any pretense of gentleness, now sharp as a blade. Think about it. If you're cut off from the family, who do you have left? You're not strong enough to stand on your own, Emily. You'll regret it. I kept my voice steady and slow. If I have to choose between regretting that I honored my grandparents' wishes or regretting that I betrayed them, I'll choose the first. And you should remember I'm strong enough to live without people who only know how to threaten me. She hung up, leaving only the cold, empty beep in my ear. Just one day later, I discovered Sophia had launched her own campaign on social media. On Instagram, she posted a black and white photo of the family taken years ago, captioned, "When someone in the family decides to take everything, forgetting the meaning of blood ties." Below it, dozens of comments from Sophia's friends and acquaintances expressed disappointment, even though they had no idea what had really happened. She also shared vague tweets like, "Money can show someone's true colors." Sadly, sometimes that person is your sister. She never mentioned my name outright, but everyone who knew us understood exactly who she meant. The rumors spread faster than I expected. A few mutual friends began texting me, asking if it was true that I wasn't giving the family a single cent. Others stayed silent, clearly swayed by Sophia's one-sided version of the story. I felt as though I'd been dragged into a public trial, accused before I could even open my mouth to defend myself. David called me that afternoon, his voice calm but firm. "Emily, I know your family is putting pressure on you. Don't sign anything and don't respond publicly online. Your grandparents anticipated this, and we will handle it in a way that leaves them with no ability to harm you." That night, I received one more message from my father. "You have 48 hours to decide. After that, don't blame us for cutting you off." I stood by the window, watching the streetlight spill through the curtains, then typed back a single sentence. "Then, you should be ready for that." I turned off my phone, sitting still in the dark, reminding myself that if my grandparents trusted me enough to give me this responsibility, then I had to be strong enough to face everything that came with it. 2 days after my grandparents' will was read, I was cooking dinner when the phone started ringing non-stop. My father called, his tone curt and without preamble. "Pack your things now. You need to be out of the apartment tonight." I thought I'd misheard, but he repeated it, this time even more clearly, like an order. When I asked why, he answered bluntly, "The lease is under our name. From now on, we don't want to be involved. Better you leave now before it becomes a problem." A chill ran down my spine, but before I could say anything else, he hung up. Less than 10 minutes later, my mother called, not to explain but to drive the point home. "Take what you need. The locks will be changed in the morning." Her voice was flat, without a trace of hesitation, as if she were talking about a routine household chore. I knew then that any pleading or arguing would be useless. I packed a day's clothes, a few folders, my laptop, and a handful of small keepsakes, most of the furniture and books I left behind. I didn't have the strength to carry them. The apartment, already modest, now felt emptier and colder than ever. Pulling my last suitcase to the door, I felt as if I were leaving a part of my life. Not because I loved the place, but because it represented the small piece of independence I had managed to build. Out in the parking lot, I sat in my car, hands on the steering wheel, my mind blank. I had nowhere to go. Hotels required a credit card limit I didn't have, and my friends all had their own lives. Then I remembered the key to my grandparents' house that David had given me after the will reading. It was tucked neatly into the small inner pocket of my bag, attached to a wooden heart-shaped keychain my grandmother had carved by hand. Just the thought of it made my heart beat faster. I took a deep breath, started the engine, and headed toward Seattle. The road to my grandparents' house was dim and misty, light rain streaking across the windshield in blurred trails. I drove slowly, remembering all the times I'd sat in the passenger seat next to my grandfather, listening to his stories as he drove me home after Sunday dinner. When I turned onto the familiar street, the two-story wooden house appeared under the warm glow of the street lamp. The wind chimes still hung from the porch, swaying gently in the breeze. I stopped in front of the gate, clutching the key in my hand, feeling both anxious and comforted. When I slid the key into the lock, the soft click made me feel as though I had stepped back in time. The door swung open, and the familiar scent washed over me, the mix of old wood and lavender my grandmother always kept in a porcelain jar by the shoe rack. Everything inside was just as it had been the last time I was here, the armchair by the window draped with the knitted blanket she made, the oak dining table with its blue porcelain tea set, and the framed photo of the three of us standing neatly on the shelf. I walked in slowly, running my fingers lightly over the tabletop, feeling the thin layer of dust that marked the passing time. Memories of warm dinners, my grandfather's laughter as he told an old story, my grandmother's hand resting on my shoulder as she brought out dessert. All of it came rushing back so vividly I could almost hear them. Standing in the middle of the living room, I closed my eyes, letting those images and sounds fill my mind completely. That night, I didn't turn on all the lights, just the small lamp in the living room, then curled up in the armchair wrapped in the knitted blanket. Rain tapped softly against the windows, and for the first time all day, I felt safe, not because this was a house, but because it was my grandparents' house, the only place left that still held the remnants of real love. I knew that from this moment on, I would have to protect it, not just as an asset, but as a piece of memory and values my grandparents had entrusted to me. The next morning, I was sitting at the small kitchen table, sipping black coffee and watching Seattle's dim gray light filter through the window when a knock sounded at the door. I froze for a second. I hadn't told anyone I was here. When I opened it, David Thompson stood there, his black trench coat speckled with fine raindrops. He stepped inside, set his briefcase on the table, and looked straight at me with a grave expression. "Emily, we need to talk right now," he began, his voice deep and decisive. David pulled out a chair, sat across from me, and opened the case. Thick stacks of documents were neatly arranged, clipped together with USB drives and memory cards. "Your grandparents anticipated all of this," he said. "They knew Michael and Patricia would never accept the entire estate going to you, and they prepared to protect you from any action they might take." I sat still, feeling both grateful and slightly chilled, as if my grandparents were still here, shielding me even after they were gone. He began laying it out piece by piece. A series of legal filings, property ownership documents, the share registration contracts for Reed Construction, all signed and properly notarized. There were also handwritten letters from my grandparents to David, clearly explaining their reasons for naming me as sole heir. These letters expressed their wishes and reasoning. "They'll be invaluable if there's ever a dispute," David explained. I reached out to touch the pages, my grandmother's familiar handwriting appearing before me, neat and elegant. Next, he opened a small aluminum case containing hard drives and memory cards. "This," David said, lowering his voice, "is evidence. The new security camera system your grandparents had installed last year. It clearly shows Michael and Sophia coming here after the funeral, before you arrived, and taking several items." My chest tightened as David plugged in a USB and pulled up the footage. On the screen, my father rifled through the glass cabinet in the living room, while Sophia stood beside him, holding a large handbag, slipping inside jewelry pieces I knew belonged to my grandmother. They assumed the old system was still in place, the one Michael had installed years ago with plenty of blind spots. But your grandparents replaced it with a newer model and entrusted Miguel to oversee it, David said. The name Miguel brought back memories. Miguel Santos, the caretaker who had been with my grandparents for over 20 years. David gave a faint smile. He's still in the small house behind the garden. He knew you'd come here and has agreed to help you in any way you need. David explained that my grandparents treated Miguel like family, trusted him completely, and often left him in charge of important documents when they traveled. David continued, aside from Miguel, you also have the support of Laura, the CEO of Reed Construction, and Helen Brooks, the longtime accountant and investment manager. Laura has been with the company for over 15 years, loyal to the philosophy and values your grandparents built. She will help ensure that your shares and rights in the company are never compromised. As for Helen, she manages the entire investment portfolio and will guide you through understanding how to handle these assets. He slid another folder toward me. Inside were copies of my grandmother's journals, each page meticulously recording family events. I read an entry she had written not long ago. Michael came by today, didn't ask about our health, immediately asked to borrow $200,000 for Sophia's new project. We refused, and he left in anger. These words weren't just memories. They were evidence of how my parents had treated my grandparents as an endless source of capital. David leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Emily, I'll be blunt. They won't stop. They'll come here, maybe tomorrow, maybe even this afternoon, to take back what they believe is theirs. We have to be ready. I swallowed hard, then nodded. So, how do we prepare? I asked. He began listing steps. First, we'll reinforce security. Miguel has already activated full surveillance coverage inside and out, with all data stored on a secure cloud system. Second, Laura will draft an internal statement to the entire company, confirming you as the sole and lawful shareholder to block any attempt by Michael to meddle. Third, Helen and I will lock down all bank accounts, ensuring no one but you has access. Just then, there was a light knock on the door, and a woman in her early 40s, wearing a deep blue suit, stepped inside Laura. Her features were sharp, her gaze direct and professional. Emily, she said, shaking my hand, I've heard so much about you from your grandparents. I'm here to make sure their company, now your company, remains steady. Right behind Laura came another woman, her neatly cropped silver hair framing a warm smile, Helen Brooks. She placed a folder on the table. These are the complete financial reports. It will take time to go through them, but I'll walk you through each step. We spent the entire morning at that table. David steered the meeting like a strategy briefing. He showed me asset maps, listed each investment, and explained the legal mechanisms protecting them. Miguel stopped by occasionally to bring more coffee and update us on the security around the property. I realized then that everyone in that room knew exactly what their role was, almost as if my grandparents had entrusted them with this plan long ago, preparing for this very moment. As the sun began to sink low, David looked at me and said, tomorrow, it's highly likely they'll show up. And when they do, we won't just be protecting this property. We'll be protecting your grandparents' wishes. They chose you, Emily, not because you're their granddaughter by blood, but because they trusted that you understand the value of what they built. Don't forget that. I clenched my hands together, feeling the fear still there, but beneath it a growing layer of resolve. That evening, after everyone had left, I stood on the back porch, watching the warm light from the main house fall over the rows of lavender. I remembered something my grandmother once told me when I was little. Some things are worth fighting for, not because they belong to you, but because you belong to them. I knew that tomorrow would be my first battle, and I would not walk into it alone. The next morning I woke early, despite having slept only a few hours. The air inside my grandparents' house was still but taut. as if even the wooden walls could sense that a storm was coming. The silvery gray light of Seattle filtered through the curtains, falling across the dining table where David, Laura, Helen, and Miguel were already seated. On the table lay stacks of files, thick envelopes, USB drives, and an open laptop. Everything arranged as if preparing for a miniature courtroom. David looked up as I entered, his voice low but steady. Today we'll make it clear to them that this is not a negotiation. This is the lawful execution of your grandparents' will. Just around 9 o'clock, a firm knock sounded at the door. Miguel answered, revealing a tall man with salt and pepper hair in a sharp gray suit, Judge Thomas Harlan, my grandparents' close friend for over 30 years. Right behind him stood a woman in a police uniform, her stance strong, eyes sharp but warm. Police Chief Maria Gonzalez. David rose to shake their hands and introduce them to me. Thomas has agreed to serve as a neutral witness, and Maria, she's here to ensure everything stays within the bounds of the law. She's also someone your grandparents once helped when she was young. Maria gave me a faint smile. They paid my college tuition when I had nowhere else to turn. Today, I'm just repaying a piece of that debt. We had barely poured coffee for our guests when the sound of car engines came from a distance. The crunch of tires on gravel grew louder. I went to the window overlooking the drive and saw a line of vehicles approaching. My father's sleek black sedan, my mother's white SUV, Sophia's bright red coupe, and a pickup truck I recognized as belonging to a cousin I rarely saw. Doors swung open, and they stepped out with determined expressions, like people ready to reclaim something taken from them. This time the knock wasn't polite. It was a heavy pounding, accompanied by my father's voice booming, "Emily, open the door. This is the family's house." David signaled to Miguel to open it, and as the door creaked back, my entire family nearly spilled into the foyer. They stopped short when they saw that the living room ahead of them wasn't just me. It was filled with David, Laura, Helen, Miguel, Judge Harlan, and Chief Gonzalez, standing in a line, their eyes calm but unwavering. Patricia was the first to break the silence. "What is this? What game are you playing, Emily, bringing outsiders into family business?" Chief Gonzalez stepped forward half a pace, her voice even but carrying weight. "Mrs. Reed, this property is the lawful possession of Emily Reed. My presence today is to ensure that no one violates that right. And let me be clear, any act of taking property or attempting unlawful entry can be treated as a criminal offense." Michael gave a short, mocking laugh, but his eyes wavered slightly when they landed on Judge Harlan. "Thomas, what are you doing here? This is a private matter, nothing to do with the courts." Judge Harlan answered plainly, "I am here as a witness at the request of James and Elizabeth Reed to ensure that any dispute concerning their will is recorded accurately. I will report if necessary." Only then did David speak, his voice deep and each word deliberate. "Before you say anything further, I want to hand each of you an envelope. Inside is a complete copy of the evidence related to your conduct toward James and Elizabeth Reed over the past 10 years. He stepped forward, giving the first envelope to Michael, then to Patricia, and finally to Sophia. I noticed my father's hand pause slightly as he took it, as if he already knew what was inside. "What evidence?" Patricia asked, trying to keep her tone steady. David opened his laptop and turned the screen toward them. Footage from the security cameras showed, on the day after the funeral, Michael rummaging through the glass cabinet in the living room while Sophia stood beside him, dropping my grandmother's jewelry into her handbag. "This date, this time, in this house," David said clearly. Footage stored on the new security system your grandparents had installed, overseen by Miguel. In addition, we have handwritten journal entries by Elizabeth Reed, describing in detail each time Michael and Sophia came here to demand money or property. Laura then stepped in. "And here are Reed Construction financial records. They show multiple personal loans taken from the company by Michael that were never repaid, even when the company was previously family-owned. However, Helen added, the investment portfolio also shows multiple withdrawals made by Patricia Reed from the family account for personal expenses, unrelated to business operations or shared needs. The room fell silent for several seconds, the only sound the rustle of paper as my parents opened the envelopes and looked inside. I saw confusion flash across my father's face, while my mother flushed red, her lips pressed tightly together. Sophia held her envelope but didn't open it. She simply glared at me. Trying to humiliate the whole family. Is that it? You think this stack of papers is going to keep you safe? Chief Gonzalez arched an eyebrow, her tone now sharper. Miss Sophia, this is not a stack of papers. These are documents that could become evidence if this matter goes to court. And I advise all of you to understand that from this point forward, any action that violates the law will be dealt with immediately. Michael set the envelope down on the table, glancing around the room as if searching for an escape route. We don't have to make this such a big deal, he said, his voice far less forceful than when he first arrived. But David didn't allow him to steer the conversation. This has been a big deal for a long time, Mr. Reed. Today is simply the day everyone is forced to face it. I had stayed silent from the beginning, watching everything unfold, feeling each layer of emotion pass through me, fear, tension, and then, gradually, relief. Relief that I was no longer standing alone. They could raise their voices, they could threaten. But this time, I had a wall of people and the truth standing between me and them. I took a long, deep breath, letting the tension leave with it, and then rose to my feet. The room went utterly still, every eye fixed on me. I looked directly at my parents and Sophia, my voice slow but steady, without a trace of a tremor. The only condition for me to maintain any relationship with this family is that you fully respect my grandparents' will and immediately end every action, every threat, every attempt to take this property. If you can't, then we have nothing left to say to each other. My father raised his eyebrows slightly, as if he still wanted to argue, but the looks from Judge Harlan and Chief Gonzalez made him stop short. My mother's eyes flicked to David, then to the thick envelope in front of her, as though calculating. Sophia crossed her arms, lips pressed tight, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. For the first time since walking in, she seemed to realize she no longer had the freedom to act as she pleased. David opened a folder and placed several stacks of papers on the table. These are prepared restraining orders, effective the moment they're signed. If anyone violates them, the consequences will be legal, not family business. I picked up the pen and signed each one, the blue ink carving itself across the crisp white pages. The scratch of the pen in the silence felt like the final punctuation to their control over me. Helen then slid forward a list of items taken from the house after the funeral. I read each line. Familiar objects like my grandfather's pocket watch, my grandmother's pearl necklace she wore on holidays, several small paintings that had hung in the hallway. I looked up. I require all of these to be returned in full within 48 hours. If not, I will file an official complaint and let the police handle it. Chief Gonzalez nodded firmly. We will be monitoring that deadline closely. Don't test whether I'm serious. No one replied directly. My father stared out the window. My mother stared down into her handbag, and Sophia pretended to check her phone. But I knew they understood and feared that every move they made from now on could be scrutinized, recorded, and used as evidence in court. That knowledge stripped away the bluster they usually carried, leaving only reluctant compliance, forced by the corner they'd been backed into. Judge Harlan rose to his feet, his voice deep and steady, like the echo of a gavel striking in a courtroom. I trust everyone here understands the consequences of going against the wishes of James and Elizabeth Reed. Legally, Emily is the sole rightful owner of this entire estate. There is no longer any basis for dispute. His words were like the key turning shut on the door they had been trying to pry open for so long. My father was the first to stand, offering no farewell, just a clipped, "We'll see," his voice stripped of any confidence. My mother followed in silence, her face cold as stone. Sophia was last. She paused, looking at me as if about to speak, then simply let out a short huff and turned away. The sound of the door closing echoed through the living room, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unnatural. I stood there for a few more seconds, feeling each layer of tension dissolve. Laura gave a faint smile. That was the hardest part. David gathered the documents and nodded. From now on, Emily, they can't touch anything that belongs to you, legally or otherwise. You're out of their control. I knew it wasn't truly over. They might try to find new ways to circle back. But in that moment, one thing was clear. For the first time in my life, the power was no longer in their hands. And more importantly, I had stood up for myself and protected what my grandparents had trusted me to guard. That evening, I sat alone in my grandfather's study, the afternoon light spilling through the wooden window frames, casting a warm gold across the desk. In a drawer I had never opened before, now lay a jar. Inside it were financial documents and several handwritten letters my grandparents had exchanged in their younger days. The figures in those files stopped me cold. An investment they had quietly built over the years had grown beyond expectation, now worth over $12 million. I remembered my grandfather's words, "Money only truly matters when it creates opportunities for others." The next day, I began working with David and Helen to draw up a plan. Within weeks, the Elizabeth and James Reed Scholarship Fund was officially established, seeded with $12 million. Its mission was clear: support hardworking students from disadvantaged backgrounds, especially those from small towns like the one where my grandparents had started their lives. I wanted the fund not only to provide scholarships, but also mentorship programs, connecting students with people who had walked the path before them. When the press release went out, my phone rang non-stop. Reporters called, curious why I would make such a move so soon after an intense family dispute. I gave only a brief answer. This is how I honor my grandparents' legacy. And it's also how I remind myself never to let what once hurt me define who I am. Alongside running the fund, I continued the business work I loved. But unlike the past, I no longer drove myself into 60-hour weeks just to prove my worth. I structured my time more deliberately, taking on only the projects that genuinely inspired me. Money was no longer the sole measure of success. I chose a simpler life, one that left room for the community around me. Even my grandparents' home began to transform. I opened its doors to community activities, weekend craft workshops, a Wednesday night book club, and skills seminars organized by the Scholarship Fund. The spacious living room now held a long table and shelves of books, while the backyard had been remade into an outdoor event space. Each summer, we hosted Read Day, a gathering where scholarship recipients met with donors, shared their stories, and inspired one another. Over time, I realized I had regained something I thought I'd lost: confidence. Not the kind you wear like armor to fend off criticism, but the quiet steadiness that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you stand. I also learned how to set boundaries. Not everyone who had hurt me deserved the chance to come back into my life, and that was perfectly fine. Messages, emails, and indirect invitations from my old family still appeared from time to time, but I no longer felt any obligation to respond. A simple, "I don't care," in my own mind, was enough to keep me out of the toxic spiral. I understood now that forgiveness didn't mean allowing them to return and continue the same patterns. The best part was that I had found my chosen family: friends, colleagues, and new mentors. David was always there with steady legal guidance. Laura was more than a colleague. She was the sister I'd never had. Miguel and Helen often dropped by to help prepare events, bringing laughter and home-cooked dishes. Chief Gonzalez and Judge Harlan occasionally attended scholarship fund meetings, not as officials, but as old friends of my grandparents who wanted to contribute. One autumn afternoon, sitting with everyone on the porch, I realized something remarkable. The family I had always longed for, the people who valued me, respected my boundaries, and cheered on my growth had nothing to do with blood. They were here because I had opened the right doors at the right time, and because I'd had the courage to let go of the old ties. Looking back, I could see the change clearly. From someone who once let the fear of losing her family's love control every decision, I had become someone who actively built a life that was free and full of meaning. This house, this scholarship fund, these people, they were proof that the past cannot stop anyone from creating a better future. 6 months later, on a calm May morning, I drove out to the cemetery on the edge of town, where my grandparents rested beneath two old oak trees. The road leading in was lined with wildflowers in purple and gold, and a light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. I brought with me a bouquet of peonies, my grandmother's favorite, and an envelope holding a photograph from the first Elizabeth and James Reed Scholarship Awards ceremony. I knelt by the headstone, laid the flowers neatly, and brushed away the fine layer of dust on the stone surface. My voice came out softly, as if I were speaking directly to them. Grandma, Grandpa, everything is going just the way you wanted. The scholarship has given opportunities to our first 15 students, and they're all taking their first steps with confidence. The house, it's still full of warmth and laughter, just like when you were here. I opened the envelope and placed the photo beside the bouquet. In it, I stood among a group of young faces full of hope. The house in the background, now transformed into a community hub. Their eyes shone the same way mine had the first time my grandparents put their trust in me. I knew that if they were still here, they would be proud, not because of the number in the fund's account, but because of the spirit it stood for. I sat there for a long time, and it became clear to me the real value I had regained wasn't in the $36 million or any legal clause. All those numbers, in the end, were only tools. What mattered most was freedom. The freedom to choose the life I wanted, the freedom to say no to what hurt me, and the freedom to build what I believed was right. I had regained a community, a small but steadfast circle of people who weren't bound to me by blood, but who loved and respected me unconditionally. And above all, I had regained my dignity, the very thing my old family had once tried to strip away through contempt and control. I remembered the years before, when a single word or glance from them was enough to make me doubt myself. I had lived for so long just to prove I was worthy of love, even at the cost of my health, my time, and my dreams. But now, I no longer had to prove anything to anyone. I was myself, and that was enough. Before leaving the cemetery, I placed my hand on the headstone and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma and Grandpa, for trusting me, for leaving me not just an inheritance, but the belief that I could write the rest of my story on my own." On the drive home, I thought of the people hearing this story. Maybe you've been in my place, pressured to give up what is yours, told your worth doesn't count because you didn't follow the path your family wanted. If you're in that cycle now, I want you to remember this. You have the right to protect your legacy, your time, your work, and your worth, even in the face of pressure from the people closest to you. Blood is not a license for someone to cross your boundaries. If someone truly loves and respects you, they will work with you to protect what matters, not try to take it or harm it. Standing up for yourself does not make you a traitor or a bad child. It makes you someone brave enough to break the cycle of injustice and build a healthier future for yourself and those around you. My story ends with a clear outcome. The assets were protected, the toxic control was broken, and a new community was formed. But the true victory wasn't in the legal documents. It was in the days I now live in peace, doing work I love and sharing its rewards with those who need it most. And now, I want to hear your story. Have you ever had to stand up against injustice within your own family? Have you ever set a boundary and held it, knowing it would come at a cost? If you have, share it in the comments below. Because sometimes, just knowing someone else has done it can give us the courage to do the same. You are not alone, and your story, like mine, might be the light someone out there needs more than anything.